Justice Marlene Harris opened her front door just as the sun began to warm the air. She felt the first soft rays touch her face and lifted her eyes to the sky, grateful for another day. Behind her, Baxter, her elderly Labrador, stood patiently. On the porch with his leash in his mouth, he was gentle and slow now, his muzzle graying with age, but his tail still wagged whenever she spoke his name. She clipped the leash onto his collar, and together they stepped onto the neat sidewalk that curved past manicured lawns and flower beds. The morning was quiet. Birds hopped among the bright blooms and sang their cheerful songs. The neighbor's cat dozed in the shade of a low fence. A few houses down, a family left for work and school, children chattering as they climbed into a waiting car. Justice Harris enjoyed these simple moments. She breathed in the sweet scent of jasmine that climbed along the fence by her gate.
Baxter.
Excited for their walk, pulled gently ahead, sniffing every crack in the sidewalk, every fresh patch of grass. They moved at an easy pace. Justice Harris had lived on this street for nearly 30 years. She remembered when the houses were newer, the trees smaller. She and her late husband had planted one of those saplings herself. Now it stretched tall and strong, offering cool shade in summer. She often paused under its branches to adjust her robe or give Baxter an affectionate pat. Today, she wore a simple light blue cardigan over her judicial robes. Her hair, once thick and dark, was now silver and pinned neatly behind her ears. Her gentle gaze took in every detail of her neighborhood. Across the street, two uniformed officers stepped onto the curb near a red brick house. They spoke in low voices, glancing around as if they expected trouble. Justice Harris noticed them and slowed her step. Baxter sat at her side, tail wagging. In friendly greeting, she raised a white-gloved hand in a polite wave, and one of the officers nodded in return. She thought nothing of it after all. Their jobs often took them everywhere. As they continued, Baxter sniffed at the base of a garden. He lifted one paw and tilted his head, curious. Justice Harris crouched to scratch behind his ears, smiling as he leaned into her touch. She felt a small thrill of happiness. Even at 78, she delighted in these quiet mornings, these simple joys. The officers moved closer, their radios crackling softly. One held a folder, the other a flashlight and a pair of work gloves. They passed by without comment until suddenly, Baxter, startled by the radio noise, barked once. The sound cracked through the calm air. Justice Harris stood, surprised by the sharp echo. Baxter archly wagged his tail at the officers, his bark friendly and welcoming. The taller officer raised his hand. "Easy there, boy," he said, his voice firm but calm. He took a step backward, reaching for what looked like a taser on his belt. Justice Harris froze. She sensed the moment had changed. Her heart beat faster, and she reached out to Baxter to calm him. Baxter barked again, louder this time, and bounded forward. His eyes were bright, his tail wagging furiously. He meant no harm. He simply wanted to greet everyone. But the officer, taken by surprise, flinched. The taser came out, aimed at the dog. Justice Harris gasped. "No, please," she began, her voice trembling. She stepped forward, trying to show she meant no threat. Before she could reach Baxter, a shot rang out. The sound was sharp, like thunder on a clear day. Justice Harris's knees buckled, and she sat heavily on the pavement. Baxter's bark cut off abruptly. Time seemed to slow. She stared at the dog, fear and confusion flooding her. Baxter lay on the sidewalk, motionless. His eyes were wide, and his fur was matted. Justice Harris's hand flew to her chest, where her heart pounded wildly. The taller officer dropped the taser as if burned. His face turned pale. He reached for a radio, hands shaking. "Dispatch, we need medical at Elminoak," he called out. His partner knelt beside Baxter, pressing his gloved hand to the dog's side. Justice Harris rose unsteadily, her robes rustling. She took a step toward them, her voice small. "He's just a dog," she said. "Please help him." Neither officer looked at her. They were too focused on Baxter, their own shock, and worry mirrored in their eyes. Justice Harris crouched beside her dog, her hands shaking as she touched his head. His eyes met hers for a moment, soft, trusting, confused. She stroked his ear, her tears falling freely. Baxter's breathing was shallow. Justice Harris whispered. To him, words he could not understand, but that carried all her love. Neighbors gathered, drawn by the sound. Some stood back in shock. Others hurried forward, phones in hand, ready to record what they saw. Justice Harris barely noticed them. All her attention was on Baxter. She prayed for him to breathe more easily. She prayed for his eyes to close in peaceful sleep, not in pain. Moments later, a medical team arrived. They knelt on the pavement, speaking in quick, calm voices. Justice Harris stood, her cardigan falling open, hands clenching at her sides. She waited, her breath catching in her throat. After what felt like an eternity, one of the medics looked up. Ma'am, he said gently, we're going to take him to the animal hospital. You can ride with us. Justice Harris nodded, stepping aside so they could lift Baxter onto a stretcher. She watched as they carried him to the ambulance parked at the curb. One officer held the ambulance door open for her. She climbed in, her legs heavy. She sat beside her dog, leaning close. She cradled his head, tears falling on his fur. Eyes fluttered, but did not open again. The ride to the hospital was a blur of flashing lights and murmured voices. Justice Harris held Baxter's paw, her mind racing. She thought of all the cases she had judged, all the lives she had touched. She thought of the justice she had devoted her life to serving. Now, here she was, powerless as her beloved companion lay injured beside her. At the animal hospital, a veterinarian and her assistant took Baxter from Justice Harris's arms. They led him into a brightly lit treatment room. Justice Harris stayed. Behind, sitting on a plastic chair, her head in her hands, she closed her eyes, remembering happier mornings, Baxter chasing a squirrel, Baxter trembling with excitement when she came home, Baxter resting his head on her lap as she read the morning news, not noticed the door open until a nurse stepped in. Justice Harris. The nurse said softly. Justice Harris looked up, her face pale. The nurse sat beside her. The doctor will see you soon, she said. He's doing everything he can. Justice Harris nodded. She looked down at her hands, the symbol of her office a gold ring, etched with the scales of justice shown on her finger. She thought about the life she had lived, the respect her position commanded, and how today none of that mattered. All that mattered was Baxter's life. She took a deep breath and let it out slowly. Outside the treatment room, she heard the muffled sound of phone cameras. She raised her head and peered through the glass. Neighbors and onlookers had gathered outside, some holding signs asking for justice, others simply watching. She wondered how many of them knew who she was. Finally, the veterinarian emerged. He wore scrubs and a worried expression. Justice Harris, he asked. She stood. Her voice was small. How is he? He hesitated, looking at the floor. The bullet hit him in the side, he said quietly. We've done what we can. He's stable for now, but it's too early to say if he will make a full recovery. Justice Harris closed her eyes at the words, stable. That meant hope, however fragile. She thanked the doctor and returned to the waiting chair. She stared at the linoleum floor, her mind replaying every second of the shooting. She felt anger and sadness, but also a calm determination. She would help Baxter heal. She would find answers. Hours passed as she sat alone. At last, the vet came again. He's out of surgery, he said. He's resting. You can see him now. Justice Harris followed him into the recovery room. Baxter lay on a soft blanket, tubes and monitors attached to him. His breathing was steady. She knelt and placed her hand on his shoulder. He nudged her hand with his nose. She closed her eyes and let a single tear slide down her cheek. In that moment, she made a silent promise. She would call the chief of police herself. She would ask for an explanation. She would speak up for Baxter, for all vulnerable creatures. And she would heal. Alongside her loyal friend who had greeted strangers with nothing but love. Outside, the sun was setting. Justice Harris stayed by Baxter's side, holding his paw. The quiet neighborhood slept under the gathering dusk, unaware that tomorrow would bring questions and change. But for now, in the soft hush of the animal hospital, Woman and dog found comfort in each other's presence. The next morning, Justice Harris woke before dawn. The hospital's fluorescent lights had lulled her into a restless sleep, dreams haunted by Baxter's soft eyes and unsteady breathing. Now in her quiet bedroom, she sat on the edge of her bed and whispered into the dim light, "Good morning, my boy." Her voice trembled, half prayer, half plea. She rubbed her eyes and rose, slipping into a plain gray sweater over her pajama top. Her robe lay folded on a chair today. She would not wear it. She walked down the hallway on soft slippers, each step echoing in the still house. In the living room, photos of her late husband and their younger selves smiled from the mantel. She paused at one picture, them in graduation gowns, dreams bright in their eyes. She touched the frame, remembering how they had vowed to serve justice, he as a lawyer. She to follow his path into the courtroom. That promise had led her here, to the state's Supreme Court bench. But now the bench seemed far away, and this morning felt urgent. In the kitchen. She poured coffee into her favorite mug-white porcelain with a small gold seal that she had received on her appointment day. The bitter steam rose as she lifted it to her lips, but she barely tasted it. Instead, she sat at the table and reached for her phone. Her hands shook as she opened the news app. The screen was filled with headlines. Officer shoots dog on. Quiet street. Judge's pet in hospital after police incident. Neighbors demand answers. She scrolled through articles, some neutral, some sensational. One headline shouted, "Supreme Court judge's dog victim of police violence. Justice." Harris closed her eyes, pinching the bridge of her nose. She felt a mix of disappointment and resolve. The media could twist facts, but she needed the truth. She tapped a bookmarked number, the animal hospital. A calm voice answered. "Animal Care Center," the nurse said. "I'm calling for Anne." "Update on Baxter," she said quietly. "Is he stable?" The nurse hesitated, then spoke softly. "He's resting comfortably, ma'am. He's awake and responding to treatment. No? We expect him to spend another night under observation." Justice Harris felt relief warm her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. "Please let me know if anything changes." After hanging up, she finished her coffee and stared out the window at a pale sky. A lone bird flitted across power lines. She thought of Baxter lying in his kennel, frightened but alive. She reached for her legal briefcase, opened it, and pulled out a clean sheet of paper. She began to write, "Chief Arthur Reynolds, City Police Department, Elm Precinct Headquarters." She paused. The chief's name had come to her in a flash last night, whispered by her conscience. She would address him with respect but also firmness. She wrote, "I write to request a full account of yesterday's events. I also seek clarity on the protocols that guided your officers' actions when they encountered Baxter. I request details regarding any training materials and procedures for handling domestic animals in the field." She folded the letter and placed it in an envelope. She scribbled her return address in her neat hand. Then she picked up her phone again, searched Chief Reynolds, and found his direct office line. She took a deep breath, then pressed call. His assistant answered. "Chief Reynolds is in a meeting. May I take a message?" "Yes," Justice Harris said. She paused, steadying her voice. "This is Justice Marlene Harris, State Supreme Court. Please let him know that I have sent an official letter requesting his response regarding the incident at El Mayan Oak. I would appreciate his prompt attention to this matter." There was a quiet click, then the assistant spoke softly. "Yes, Justice Harris. I will pass that along." She hung up. The small victory of having her message delivered filled her with confidence. She glanced at the clock, barely 6:30. There was time before court session, but today her mind would not rest on legal briefs or petitions. Her thoughts swirled. Around Baxter, the officers, and what must be done next. She dressed in a simple blue suit and polished her black shoes. As she walked out the door, she paused on the porch. The street lay peaceful, bathed in early light, no sign of yesterday's. Crisis remained, no chalk outline, no bloodstains, no panic. Yet in her heart, everything had changed. She inhaled deeply, then signed the paper she held in her mind. A promise to Baxter, and to her community that justice would be fair, thorough, and compassionate. At the courthouse, aides greeted her with hushed respect. She nodded politely but did not speak. Her eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen vulnerability and harm, even to an innocent creature. She entered chambers, where her clerk, Mr. Patel, waited with a stack of case files. "Good morning, Your Honor," Mr. Patel said, offering her a file. "Morning," she replied, voice soft. She opened the file and read a brief summary. Today's docket included a tenant's wrongful eviction case, petition for habeas corpus, and a dispute over environmental regulations. She scanned the documents, underlining key points, yet her mind drifted back to Baxter. Mr. Patel noticed her distraction. "May I ask how Baxter's doing?" said gently. She closed the file and looked at him, surprise flickering in her eyes. Many knew she had a dog, but word of the shooting had spread quickly through legal circles. "He's stable," she said. "He'll need time to heal, but he's alive." Mr. Patel exhaled, relief on his face. "That's wonderful news." She nodded. "Thank you," she said. "I appreciate the updates." He smiled sympathetically and left her to prepare for the morning session. She sat at her desk and placed the letter to Chief Reynolds on top of her docket. It was a reminder that justice did not stop at the bench. Court convened at 9. Justice Harris took her seat behind the raised bench alongside her two fellow justices. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. She listened carefully as clerks read the preliminary matters. When the wrongful eviction case began, she focused entirely on the arguments before her, asking thoughtful questions about lease agreements and landlord responsibilities. Outside, the world perceived her as stern and unflappable. Inside, her heart weighed her responsibilities both to human litigants and to Baxter's fragile life. During the mid-morning break, she stepped into her private chambers and closed the door. She reached for her phone and saw an email from a local community group. People for Fair Policing invited her to speak at a hearing next week. They wanted her to share her experience and advocate for better training. She tapped the message open, but did not reply immediately. She needed to consider the implications. Would it be wise to speak publicly before the chief's response? Her instinct told her to stand with those who demanded safer protocols. She put down the phone and went back to court. The environmental regulation dispute was complex, involving state and federal statutes. She and her colleagues debated legal precedents, consulted experts, penned their opinions in question and answer format. The hours passed in a structured rhythm, one that contrasted with the chaos she had lived through only days before. By late afternoon, court adjourned. Justice Harris walked across the marble foyer toward her chambers, relieved that she had navigated a day of heavy cases without error. As she opened her office door, Mr. Patel was there again, holding an envelope. "Your letter arrived," he said. She took it and read the return address. Police Department Records Division. She hesitated, breath catching in her throat, then tore it open. Inside was a formal acknowledgement. They had received her letter and would respond within 14 days. The note ended with, "We appreciate your patience, Justice Harris." Placed the letter on her desk. 14 days felt both long and short. In that time, Baxter would need more surgeries. In that time, community voices would grow louder. In that time, the department's internal review would unfold. She closed her eyes and thought of Baxter resting in his kennel, ears flicking at distant sounds. She imagined his recovery slow walks in the yard, a triumphant wag of his tail, when he recognized her voice. She made a silent promise. She would not let bureaucracy stall justice. He had greeted the officers with openness and love. The system owed him respect and care in return. She rose, slipped her coat over her arm, and gathered her briefcase. Before leaving, she looked at the framed pictures on her wall, the oak tree sapling now full grown, her husband at her side, Baxter, bounding beside them, represented the journey of her life growth, partnership, loyalty. As she walked out into the fading light, she felt a new clarity. Healing would take time, but today had shown her that her role extended beyond the courtroom. It included speaking truth, seeking accountability, and uplifting the vulnerable whether they walked on 2 legs or 4. Tomorrow, she would visit Baxter at the hospital. She would hold his paw, whisper encouragement, and remind him that he was not alone. She would prepare for every challenge ahead, determined that justice would be served for all who depended on it. A heavy quiet settled over Elm Street as the shock of what had just happened began to sink in. Justice Marlene Harris knelt on the pavement beside Baxter, her beloved Labrador, her white-gloved hands trembling as she touched his head. The world felt surreal. Only moments ago, she had been enjoying a peaceful morning walk. Now she was crouched beside an injured dog, her hands stained with his blood, her heart racing with fear and confusion. Neighbors poured onto their front lawns, drawn by the crack of the shot. Some stood frozen, eyes wide, hands over mouths. Others lifted phones, ready to record. A woman in a floral robe clutched her child close. An elderly man in a wheelchair watched with solemn eyes. All looked toward Justice Harris and the two officers who had caused this. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint wheeze of Baxter's breathing. One officer knelt beside Baxter, pressing a hand to his side, where the wound lay. His partner stood stiffly, eyes darting as he realized the full weight of what had happened. Justice Harris's voice broke the silence. "Please," she whispered, "please help him." Her words carried across the street, reaching the officers and neighbors alike. Some faces softened at her plea. Others lowered their phones. Even in pain, Baxter's head lifted toward her voice. The taller officer, the one who had fired the shot, swallowed hard. He looked at Justice Harris's face. In that moment, something shifted. I saw not a stern judge or a symbol of authority, but an elderly woman cradling her friend in desperation. He rose slowly, and with a shaking hand, raised an ID badge to show his partner. "I didn't know," he said softly. His words trembled in the air. "I didn't know who she was." The second officer stood and looked at Justice Harris. His eyes welled with regret. He reached out, but Justice Harris flinched and pulled back. She closed her eyes, the pain too fresh. Baxter's shallow breaths rattled her heart. She didn't want a hand from an officer now? She only wanted her dog to live. Moments later, sirens wailed in the distance. A shrill sound pierced the morning peace. An ambulance turned onto Elm Street, lights flashing. Paramedics jumped out, carrying a stretcher. They moved quickly yet carefully around the crowd and the two officers. One paramedic knelt and checked Baxter's pulse. The other spoke in calm, urgent tones into a radio. Justice Harris watched, her chest tight. She gripped the collar of her cardigan as if it were Baxter's leash. As the paramedics loaded Baxter onto the stretcher, Justice Harris rose unsteadily. She wiped tears from her cheeks, her hands slick. An officer approached her slowly, keeping his distance. He cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said, eyes downcast. "I'm so sorry. We had a call about a suspicious dog. We didn't know. I didn't know. ... double quotes." He broke off, unable to finish. He seemed to struggle for words. Harris looked at him. She saw the apology in his face, the shame in his eyes. Her own grief mingled with a glimmer of relief that he realized his mistake. She nodded once. "Take me to him," she whispered. She turned and walked toward the ambulance, her steps slow but determined. Neighbors parted, giving her a path. Some offered quiet words of comfort. A woman placed a gentle hand on Justice Harris's shoulder. "He'll be okay," she said. Softly, though, her own voice trembled. The paramedics lifted Baxter into the ambulance. Justice Harris climbed in after him. She sat on the narrow bench beside him, her hand resting on his side. He whimpered softly. She stroked his head, whispering, "Hold on, Baxter. Hold on for me." The doors closed, and the ambulance sped away, its lights flashing through the neighborhood. Only then did the crowd stir. Phones were lowered. People looked at each other, sharing sorrow and relief. Some crossed themselves. Others clasped hands. The woman with the child gathered her family back inside. The man in the wheelchair remained, staring after the ambulance until it turned the corner. Then he wheeled slowly back toward his house, eyes distant and sad. Back on the sidewalk, the two officers stood alone, their hands hung at their sides, badges glinting in the morning sun. Neither spoke. Both felt the weight of what had occurred. A patrol car pulled up, its engine idling. Sergeant stepped out, clipboard in hand. He surveyed the scene, then approached the officers. "Report," he said simply. As they spoke, a deputy chief arrived in an unmarked car. He walked quickly to the group, his face grave. He spoke quietly into a radio, calling for an internal affairs investigator and the department chaplain. He paused, taking in the sight of Justice Harris's empty space on the street. The sergeant explained that the woman in the ambulance was a judge, but did not yet know how important her role. The deputy chief's eyes widened as the word judge registered. He placed a hand on the sergeant's arm. "Make sure she's treated with the respect her position demands," he said. Meanwhile, at the animal hospital, Justice Harris and Baxter arrived amid a flurry of staff. The doors swung open, and Baxter was wheeled inside on a stretcher. Justice Harris followed, her heart pounding. She handed a medical chart to the triage nurse, her handwriting trembling. "Justice Marlene Harris," she said softly, "owner of the patient." The nurse looked at her in surprise but nodded, guiding her to a waiting area. Justice Harris sat on a vinyl chair under a bright lamp. The sterile smell of disinfectant filled her nostrils. She closed her eyes, exhausted. In the next room, she heard Baxter's soft whimpers. She stood and walked to a glass partition. Through the window, she saw him lying on a metal table, covered in a thin blanket. A veterinarian adjusted monitors by his head. When the vet saw her, he motioned for her to come inside. Justice Harris stepped through the swinging door. The vet greeted her with a calm nod. "Judge Harris," he said, standing at her side. "Baxter is stable now. We've removed the bullet fragment and repaired the damage. He's on strong fluids and pain medication. Right now, he's resting comfortably." Justice Harris let out a breath she didn't know she held. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice cracked. The vet placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Fought hard," he said. "He's a strong dog." Justice Harris thought of the moment Baxter had bounded forward, full of trust and joy. She swallowed the lump in her throat. "He deserves to fight," she replied. The vet nodded. "He will need rest and physical therapy. But I believe he will recover enough to walk and run again." That promise felt like a gift. Justice Harris closed her eyes, picturing Baxter chasing the early morning sun as he had before. She felt both relief and determination. She would care for him every step of the way. As she left the treatment room, Justice Harris passed a nurse at the station. The nurse handed her a small card. "Chief Reynolds wants to meet you here," she said quietly. "He's on his way." Justice Harris took the card, her pulse quickening. She knew the meeting could shape how the department handled the incident, and whether other families would face the same fear. She walked to a private office in the hospital, card clutched in her hand. She opened the door and saw Chief Arthur Reynolds waiting. He stood, removing his hat with respect. His uniform was crisp, his face lined with concern. "Justice Harris," he said, bowing his head slightly. "I'm grateful you agreed to this meeting." She nodded, her heart steadying. She had questions and expectations, but first, she needed to know his stance. She closed the door behind her and took a seat. Outside, Baxter rested on his blanket, unaware of the power of the moment unfolding. Nearby, in that quiet office, two servants of the law, one civilian, one sworn officer, prepared to speak. Each held pieces of yesterday's tragedy: a wounded dog, a shaken community, and the urgent need for truth. The revelation of the judge's identity had transformed the scene on Elm Street. But now, in this room, it would guide the path toward healing, reform, and hope. Justice Harris drew in a breath and looked at Chief Reynolds. She was ready to speak her truths and to listen to his. Justice Harris sat across from Chief Reynolds in the small hospital conference room. The walls were pale green, and a single window looked out onto the parking lot. A soft hum from the air conditioner filled the space. Baxter rested behind a glass door in an adjacent room, recovering under gentle lights. Justice Harris kept glancing toward the window, imagining him waking and stretching his tired legs. Chief Reynolds folded his hands on the table. His uniform was neat, his badge polished. He looked tired but determined to speak honestly. "Judge Harris," he began, voice quiet, "I want to express my deepest regret for what happened. Your dog did nothing to deserve that. I've reviewed the preliminary report and I know my officers acted too quickly." She listened, her hands folded in her lap. Her heart still ached for Baxter, but she knew this moment mattered. It was one thing to demand apologies in public. It was another to sit here, face to face, and push for real change. She inhaled slowly. "Chief Reynolds," she said, "I appreciate your words, but words alone will not prevent this from happening again. I need to understand what steps you will take to ensure officers handle every call involving animals with proper care." The chief nodded. "I agree. That is why I have already ordered an internal review of departmental policies on animal encounters. We will examine training materials, field protocols, and use of force guidelines. I have also asked the training division to develop new modules focused on non-lethal options and de-escalation techniques when officers face domestic animals." Justice Harris considered his response. It was a start, but she knew how slow bureaucracy could be. "Will these new modules include hands-on practice? It's not enough to read a manual. Officers must learn by doing. They must see examples of how a friendly dog behaves, how gestures and tone can calm an animal, and what to do when a dog approaches." He met her gaze. "Yes, I have asked Captain Turner to organize workshops with animal behavior experts. Officers will work with trainers and volunteer dogs in controlled settings. They will learn to recognize stress signals in animals and practice calling for backup or animal control when needed." She nodded slowly. "That is encouraging, but what about accountability? Will officers who violate protocols face consequences? Will there be a clear path to discipline if they resort to lethal force without just cause?" Chief Reynolds reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folder. He slid it across the table toward her. "This contains the draft policy revisions. Section 12.4 outlines the chain of accountability. Any use of force against an animal must be reported immediately, with body camera footage reviewed within 24 hours. Officers found negligent will face suspension, retraining, or other disciplinary measures, depending on the circumstances." Justice Harris opened the folder and skimmed the pages. She saw familiar legal language, but also thoughtful provisions. She paused at the part about body camera compliance. "This is good," she said, "but I want to see regular audits of these reports, a random sample of cases each month, with summaries made public. Transparency builds trust." He smiled, relief on his face. "I agree. We will publish a quarterly report on animal-related incidents and their outcomes. We will redact personal details for privacy, but include data on how many incidents occurred, what force was used, and what resulted from each review." She closed the folder and placed it gently on the table. "Thank you, Chief. These measures will save lives, animal lives, and the safety of officers. But there is another matter. I intend to meet with community leaders and activists. They deserve a seat at the table. Will your department welcome their input?" Chief Reynolds nodded firmly. "Absolutely. We will form a community police advisory panel. It will include representatives from animal welfare groups, neighborhood associations, and legal experts. We will meet monthly to discuss policies, training, and community concerns." A sense of cautious hope rose in Justice Harris's chest. She had fought many cases in her career, but this was different. This was personal. Baxter's life hung in the balance, and with these commitments, she felt momentum building toward meaningful reform. She stood and extended her hand. "Thank you, Chief Reynolds. I appreciate your willingness to act swiftly." He stood and shook her hand, his grip firm but respectful. Moments later, she stepped out into the hallway. The nurse at the station looked up. "Anything I can do?" she asked kindly. Justice Harris shook her head. "No, thank you. I just wanted to see him." The nurse nodded and led her down the corridor to the recovery room. Through the glass, she saw Baxter. His fur was shaved around the wound and his leg was bandaged, yet his eyes followed her when he heard her soft voice. The nurse opened the door, and Justice Harris knelt beside him. She placed her hand on his blanket. "Hi, my boy," she whispered. Baxter raised his head and gave a weak wag of his tail. Tears filled her eyes as she stroked his ears. "You're brave," she told him. "You're going to be just fine." He licked her hand, his strength returning in small gestures. Justice Harris promised herself she would stay by his side until he was truly home and safe. Over the next days, news of the hospital meeting and the chief's commitment spread. Newspapers printed articles on the policy changes, and local television stations interviewed neighbors who had gathered on Elm Street. Some praised the chief, others questioned whether reforms would stick. Justice Harris read every story, noting inaccuracies and omissions. She wrote letters to editors, correcting details and urging the community to stay engaged. At home, she created a small office space in her living room. A desk with a lamp faced the window overlooking the oak tree she had planted years ago. She placed the folder of draft policies beside her computer. Each afternoon, she reviewed the language, marking suggestions in blue ink. She drafted letters to animal behaviorists asking for resources. She emailed community leaders, inviting them to join the advisory panel. One evening, as she worked by lamplight, Mr. Patel stopped by. With dinner, he placed a bowl of soup on her desk. "You should eat something," he said kindly. Justice Harris looked at the bowl, its steam curling in the air. She smiled gratefully. "Thank you," she replied. She sipped the soup and felt warmth spread through her. They talked quietly about the upcoming advisory meeting. Mr. Patel knew she valued fairness. "I think people will appreciate your leadership," he said. "You'll guide the conversation?" Justice Harris nodded. "I hope so. I want everyone, officers and citizens, to learn. We all share this community." The night passed in calm determination. By bedtime, Justice Harris closed her eyes with a mind full of plans: the workshop schedule, advisory panel structure, the public report outline. She whispered a prayer of thanks that Baxter was on the mend and asked for strength to carry forward. 2 weeks later, she attended the first community police advisory panel meeting. The room at the precinct was filled with chairs in a semicircle. Community members sat with notepads. Officers in uniform faced them. At the front, Chief Reynolds stood beside a whiteboard filled with bullet points. Justice Harris took her seat among the community representatives. The chief welcomed everyone and outlined his vision. Then Justice Harris spoke. Her voice was calm, measured, but carried the authority of her position. She thanked the chief for inviting community voices and urged open dialogue. One by one, panel members spoke: a representative from the local animal shelter, a pastor concerned about compassion, a parent advocating for children's safety, and even to younger officers who shared stories of close calls with pets. Ideas flowed: partnerships with animal control, neighborhood newsletters on safe animal practices, school programs teaching children how to interact with dogs. Justice Harris listened carefully, nodded, and added her insights from the policy draft. The chief promised to incorporate their suggestions, since a partnership grew in the room. After the meeting, Justice Harris walked outside into the warm afternoon sun. The neighborhood seemed brighter. She thought of the oak tree's leaves rustling overhead. She felt a spark of hope that from tragedy could come unity and progress. Back at home, she opened her mail. An official letter from the police department arrived, confirming the final policy updates and the schedule for training workshops. She read each line, satisfaction growing in her chest. She placed the letter in a folder labeled Reforms, alongside her own annotations. Later that evening, she sat by Baxter's side as he ate his dinner. He lapped up his food with gusto, his tail thumping against the floor. Justice Harris laughed softly. "You've always had a strong appetite," she said, stroking his back. He leaned into her hand, as if thanking her for her efforts. In that moment, she understood the power of a single life to change many. Baxter's injury had shaken a city, but it had also awakened a community to greater care and justice. She thought of the officers learning new skills, the neighbors finding common ground, the policies guiding future interactions, and she knew that progress required ongoing attention. not just a single meeting or announcement. As twilight settled, Justice Harris looked at her dog and whispered, "We did this together, Baxter. We did this for you." Baxter closed his eyes, content and safe. She smiled and promised herself to continue this work for him, for the people she served, and for the promise of justice in every corner of their world. Justice Harris settled into the passenger seat of her car, feeling a quiet relief as she drove through the familiar streets toward home. The sky was painted in soft pinks and purples at dusk, and a gentle breeze stirred the leaves of the oaks that lined Elm Street. She turned onto her block, noticing that the porch light across the way was on. Neighbors had placed small lanterns on their steps the night Baxter was shot. Tonight, they shone again, a simple sign of support that warmed her heart. She pulled into her driveway and climbed out. Baxter, walking slowly but steadily beside the vet tech, greeted her with bright eyes and a wagging tail. He still wore a light bandage around his side, but he stood tall and eager. Justice Harris crouched to meet him. His nose nudged her hand, and she smiled despite the day's long hours. "You made it home," she whispered. "Welcome back, my friend." Inside, the house felt both familiar and renewed. The soft lamplight in the living room revealed photos on the wall, Justice Harris and her husband, the oak sapling they planted, and now a new picture of Baxter in his favorite red collar. She led Baxter to his bed by the fireplace, where a soft blanket waited, sniffed the bedding, then curled up with a contented sigh. She patted his side gently and stood, brushing imaginary dust from her skirt. She moved to the kitchen and filled a bowl with water. Baxter lapped it gratefully, leaned against the counter, watching him drink. Thoughts of the past weeks flooded her mind. The day of the shooting, the fraught meeting with Chief Reynolds, the workshops, the community panel. Each step had been guided by her resolve to protect an innocent life and to bring about change. Her phone buzzed on the counter. A message from the police department's public affairs office. "Press release ready for your review. Templeton Gazette meeting at noon tomorrow." She took a deep breath and replied, "Thank you. See you tomorrow." She knew tomorrow would bring questions from reporters and more attention on the reforms. But she felt ready, buoyed by the progress she had seen. In the living room, she sank into her favorite armchair, opening a folder filled with documents. From the advisory panel meeting, she reviewed the notes, suggested school visits to teach children safe interactions with animals, a hotline for emergency animal calls, partnerships with local shelters for officer training. She marked a few items to follow up on. Then she noticed a quiet presence at her side. Baxter's head rested on her knee, his eyes half closed. She stroked his fur lightly. "Good boy," she said softly. "You're doing so well." She smiled. As he lifted his head to look at her, in his gaze, she saw gratitude and trust. Even in his own quiet way, he had helped her lead a movement for greater compassion. Night deepened outside. Justice Harris closed her folder and rose to draw the curtains. The lanterns across the street glowed like watchful friends. She moved to the bookshelf and pulled out a small framed invitation from the community group. People for Fair Policing. It thanked her for her support and invited her to speak at their annual dinner. She tucked the invitation into her briefcase. In a few weeks she would address a larger audience, sharing lessons learned and urging continued commitment. She turned to face Baxter, who was now snoozing peacefully. She knelt, pressing her forehead gently against his. "Rest well," she murmured. "We have more work ahead, but tonight we celebrate how far we've come." He blinked once, as if understanding, then closed his eyes. The next day dawned crisp and clear. Justice Harris dressed in a simple navy dress and a light cardigan. She pinned on a small brooch shaped like a scale, a nod to her life's work. She clipped an invitation from the Gazette onto her folder and headed out. At the community center, a small gathering of neighbors, activists, and journalists waited. Chief Reynolds stood near the entrance offering a warm nod. Justice Harris approached him, and they shook hands. "Good morning, Chief," she said. "Good morning, Judge Harris," he replied. "Thank you for coming," she smiled. "You for organizing this?" Inside, tables bore name tags and refreshments. A banner read, "Building Trust. Lessons from Elm Street. Justice Harris took her seat near the front. Baxter's framed photo sat on the podium, a reminder of why they were here. The event began with a short speech from the community organizer, who praised the reforms and welcomed Justice Harris to the microphone. She stood, her heart steady. She looked out at the audience, officers in uniform, children of neighbors, animal shelter volunteers, legal colleagues. She felt their respect and attention. "Thank you all for being here," she began in her clear, gentle voice. "We gathered because a dog's life mattered. When Baxter was shot, our community hurt both people and animals. But we also saw the power of compassion and the will to change. Because of you, we have new training programs, clear policies, and stronger partnerships. Because of you, our officers will know how to handle every call with care," she spoke. Of the workshops, describing how officers learn to read animal body language, how a friendly tone can calm a barking dog, how calling for backup or animal control can protect both officer and pet. She shared stories from the advisory panel, a child who learned what to do when meeting a new dog, a shelter volunteer who now trains with police recruits. She paused, looking at the photo of Baxter. "This is Baxter," she said. "He is my friend, my constant companion. When he bounded toward officers, he meant only to say hello. He trusted us all. And so I trust that we will uphold the changes we set in motion. Today, I ask each of you to continue this work. Be ambassadors of care, whether you wear a badge. Live next door, or stand in this room." Applause followed. Justice Harris stepped down, and Chief Reynolds joined her on stage. They answered questions from the audience. How will you sustain training? How can citizens get involved? What future panels are planned? They spoke together, showing unity and shared purpose. After the event, neighbors approached her to share thanks and suggestions. A young girl offered handmade thank you cards with paw prints. An older man invited her to talk at the tree planting ceremony next week. She accepted each invitation with a smile, grateful for the community's passion. That evening, she returned home to find Baxter waiting at the door. He greeted her with gentle excitement, his eyes bright. She knelt and embraced him. "Welcome home," she said. He licked her hand and she laughed softly. Inside, she prepared a small dinner and set a plate for Baxter. He ate eagerly, then lay by the fire with a contented sigh. Justice Harris took her seat across from him, opening her laptop to review the Gazette draft. The article praised the reforms and quoted her speech. She noted a minor correction and sent it back. Satisfied, she closed the laptop and sat quietly listening to the crackle of the fire. She thought of the journey they had taken, the shock of that morning, the uncertainty in the hospital, the tense meeting with the chief, the workshops, the community panels, and now this peaceful night at home. She understood that change required effort, listening, and persistence. It required empathy for both humans and animals. She reached down and patted Baxter gently. "We did it," she whispered. "We proved that one voice can spark many." Baxter closed his eyes and she smiled. As the night deepened, she stood and switched off the lamp. In the dim glow of the fire, she said a silent prayer of gratitude for Baxter's recovery, for the officers willing to learn, for the neighbors who stood beside her. She walked to the window and looked out at the oak tree, its branches swaying softly. Lanterns still flickered across the street, a symbol of caring light in the darkness. She turned and joined Baxter by the hearth. He slept at her feet, peaceful and safe. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and sat in the rocking chair, her mind at ease. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they celebrated a victory for justice and compassion. In that quiet moment, Judge Marlene Harris understood that true justice goes beyond courtrooms. It lives in everyday acts of kindness, in policies that protect the vulnerable, and in the courage to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. And it lived here, in a small home on Elm Street, where a dog named Baxter and an elderly black woman who stood for fairness found healing and hope together.